Yeah.
I've just had the sound engineer coming along to check we're all good, but I think we're ready to go.
Have we got participants on?
Believe so, yeah. And I mean, I'll welcome one of our attendees in a second. But just for the purpose of any new listeners, the AMA session stands for Ask Me Anything. And it's just a chance for people to ask Phil a question about the sales industry, sales profession, or indeed anything they'd like to ask. And Phil, perhaps you could briefly introduce yourself before we start.
Sure. Yes, well, I'm Phil Squire. I'm the CEO of Consalia. We're London and Singapore located organization. And we've been working in the area of sales and sales education now since 2006. And very excited to be here on these webinars.
Indeed. I'm glad you're excited to be here. And we'll get going with one of our pre-submitted questions, which comes from Ian Jones. And Ian's actually dialed in. So thank you for coming on, Ian. Ian's question is, how can salespeople get accurate information about what their customers want from them and are not getting?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a question that's not often asked, in my experience, by selling organizations. The questions of how do you get perceptions of the sales force in particular. I think what organizations tend to do is they tend to be pretty good at things like Net Promoter Score assessments, which tends to be a post-sales kind of survey, and where you're looking at kind of service delivery, and perhaps within that you might get some questions about the role of the salesperson in delivering the kind of service. So it's actually quite, in my experience, quite unusual to actually ask customers the question about, how do you want to be sold to, and to what extent are salespeople selling to you in the way that you actually want? I mean, the obvious answer to this question is to pick up the phone and ask customers. But I guess the question is, who should ask those questions? In a sense, if a salesperson phones up a customer and asks the question, what do you want from us? What aren't you getting? You may get the full picture. But what quite a number of our clients have found is that when they use an external organization to actually do a survey, it sort of elevates the importance of the exercise, and you can get a lot of information that perhaps would otherwise be hidden from the salesperson. Customers, it's not in every case, but customers tend not to want to sort of give the warts and all kind of picture, perhaps, on salesmanship in general. So I think there's a couple of ways you can go about it. There's one could do a certain amount of quantitative analysis of how customers perceive salespeople, which you could get from the kind of mindset surveys that Consalia has, which is on the Consalia website. But you can also have a qualitative analysis, which is where you'd have a more in-depth one-on-one discussion with customers about what customers want from them. I've seen some quite interesting kind of frameworks for getting feedback from salespeople in terms of looking at value and values. What value do you want from a sales person now that you're not getting? What value are you getting from a salesperson that you want to keep, and what value is the salesperson trying to sell to you that you're simply not interested in? And it's quite interesting to actually map that kind of input against what the salesperson thinks the customer would respond to that kind of question. And then you can also look at the concept of values, which is a subject very close to our heart here at Consalia. And you could ask customers a similar question: what values do you see from the salespeople that you like and want to keep? What values would you like to get from salespeople but don't have, and so on. So having that kind of structured input about salesmanship, I think, can be very insightful and can inform an organization's sort of account management planning approach, and it can also provide some useful input to the salespeople about ways in which they can perform. But actually, there's one quite interesting story that perhaps I could share, which is when I was doing my doctorate in the very early days. I remember interviewing the chief technology officer of an organization called Vodafone about this very question on behalf of Hewlett Packard, one of our technology clients. And the CTO was really quite forthright about what he expected from salespeople. And he was quite provocative in some of his challenges. He came up with phrases like, salespeople spend too little time focused on the customer. No salesperson has asked if they could have a desk in my office. No salespeople have actually asked if they can join us for briefing sessions with analysts. These are the kind of things that you would expect to get from the best salespeople. And of course, once that interview had happened, the account manager then picked up the phone and said, "Can I have a desk in your office, please?" and it kind of led or completely transformed the relationship with this account manager from being sort of quite negative to quite positive. And what was then interesting was that there was a suggested change of account manager for that particular account at the time, and the CTO of Vodafone said, "If you change the account manager, I'm going to change the supplier." So it just shows how important it is to have, that chemistry. And it also shows the value of engaging with customers with this kind of information. So Ian, that's a great question you've posed. I don't know if you've got any further thoughts to add to that, but I'm very happy if you want to of chip in. And
I've just clicked the allow to talk button.
Oh, okay.
If Ian wants to come off mute and talk, he is more than welcome to.
Okay.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Phil. That was a very helpful response, and I greatly appreciated it. The only other thing that I would want to say would be to underline the importance of the third-party involvement. Like you, during the course of my career, I've done a fair number of loss reviews on behalf of clients.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I ask a client, obviously, before I go out to do the loss review is, what are your salesmen telling you was the reason that they lost that particular piece of business? And the answer is, you can appreciate very frequently, was, we lost it on price.
Price. Oh, yeah.
So I would go out and have a very long conversation with this client of my client and get a very involved, detailed reason for why my client was not selected. And when I take that, when that message came to an end, I would say to the individual I was talking to, well, you may be interested to know that the salesperson that comes to talk to you, when asked by his manager why they had lost this particular piece of business, his reply was that it was lost on price, and you haven't mentioned price once. Could you help me to understand why that discrepancy in view between you and the salesperson? And he said, "Cool, blimey, yeah. That there are two reasons. One, it gets rid of him quickly if I tell him that they lost on price. And secondly, if I told him the real reasons, he wouldn't understand what I was talking about." So there is a kind of message behind that that says that irrespective of whether a third party is involved to gather the intelligence, the salesperson, if they are gathering the intelligence, and hopefully they do it before the business is lost, if they use the old adage of you have two ears and one mouth and you should behave accordingly, and ask the right questions around the progress of the sale, which would determine which way the wind was blowing, then maybe the loss of the sale could be averted, and the intelligence that the salesperson was looking for might come their way.
Yeah, that's a great point you make, and indeed, it sort of very much corroborates the kind of data that we get from clients who go through the effort of doing win-loss reviews, and but that again is quite an interesting question as to what extent do people really sit down and analyze why they lose business. And I suspect that quite a number of customers, even on perhaps fairly significant deals, tend to be moving on to the next deal rather than spending enough time in a sort of deeply reflective sense, sort of analyzing what went wrong. But I don't know if you've got a point of view on that.
Yeah, Phil, I have observed that, and it is, as you point out, the sign of a non-learning organization.
Yeah.
If one doesn't learn from one's losses and one's mistakes, then the opportunity for improving going forward is lost.
Yeah, I think the opposite is also interesting, is actually looking at why did you win as well. I think you can learn from both kind of scenarios. But no, it's really good point that you've raised, and a great question. So thank you for that. So
Sure.
Luke, perhaps we can move on to one of the next questions.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's take a step away from the sales process, perhaps, and ask, why did you venture into a career in sales?
Well, probably like a lot of people, I fell into it by complete accident. I'm not sure that it was a conscious decision. I remember when my first job was actually in banking, so it had nothing to do with sales at that stage of my career. And I then moved into the insurance sector, and pardon me. And that was very much about sales, but then yes, I moved into kind of sales, but it was, I see one of the other questions that has been sent into, which may be linked to this question, which is about what is it that's changed in sales over the years. But I then moved and joined what I thought was a sales and marketing consulting. It was a marketing consulting group. And whilst they presented themselves as a sales and marketing consultancy, it was really a sales training business. It was known as Mercury. But I found that once I started to get what was actually at the time one of the best kind of trainings you could ever get in sales, through that consulting group, I really started to enjoy it. So I'm not sure that it was a happy accident in a way. I've enjoyed almost every minute of my career in sales. I think it's you have these incredible highs when you close opportunities, and you get these lows when you miss them. But the adrenaline that you get from the business of doing the business of selling is something that I think never leaves you, no matter what stage you're at in your career. But no, it certainly wasn't. It certainly wasn't a profession that I was really aware of. And of course, now we're trying to change that. We're trying to elevate the profession of sales, which I think is slowly changing, at least in the UK, with the work we've done with the Institute of Apprenticeships, with getting the undergraduate degrees, sales education is terribly important, which you know about. Of course, you've been through it yourself, Luke. So it's something that we're changing. And I think it's one of the things that actually the UK government has done, which has been incredibly progressive. Other countries don't have the same setup as we do. So for that, we need to be grateful.
Yeah, of course. In Ian's first question, he asked us about information. How do we get that information from our customers? How do we get the information we're not getting? And I suppose that comes into highlights the importance of understanding your customer. And one of the other questions we've had is talked about the looming recession. And it's asked, with talk of a recession looming, how can sales leaders get ahead of the curve with their customers? So that in itself is a question, but is there a part there that as we go into this recession, do we need to know even more about our customer than we ever did before?
Well, I think, of course, the answer is of course that's true. And I actually have kind of sensed that the impact, certainly in Europe, and I'm not sure if this is a global issue, of the Ukraine situation has been higher than the pandemic from a kind of a recession point of view. During the pandemic, the tech industry sort of led the way. Their stock market valuations got higher and higher. And of course, just recently, there's been a complete readjustment and trillions taken off stock market valuations of some of these organizations. But it's not just affecting the tech industry, it's affecting, it's affecting, as we all know, the cost of living. It's difficult to get food supplies through, as we're hearing from the Ukraine situation. And I think the whole world is becoming sort of fairly nervous. So to your question, what do sales leaders need to do to get ahead of the curve? And I think that it's going to be harder and harder to manage the business of selling in an environment where markets are shrinking. Customers are going to be delaying decisions and pushing investment decisions from one quarter to the next. And there's going to be an inevitable kind of downsizing of, if you like, market opportunity. And I guess the response to that, as far as a sales leader is concerned, is to start to think about what can the sales organization be doing in order to mitigate cost or limit unnecessary costs in the business, in order to adjust the size of the sales force to suit the market opportunity that exists. You could argue that could be a fairly short-term kind of strategy, in the sense of perhaps now is the time to invest in sales at the moment that the market's shrinking. Don't take salespeople away from talking to customers. Invest more in sales. But there will inevitably be some sales leaders who, in order to get ahead of the curve, and I'm talking here about balancing income with cost, have no choice but to reduce some of the sales marketing resources they have in the organization. The challenge with that approach is that whereas short term, there may not be any obvious impact on revenue, it will surely affect the organization in the longer term, because they won't have sufficient resource to sort of generate future business. So being ahead of the curve, yes, you may have to do a certain amount of trying to strip out costs that don't have a long-term impact on the business. You're going to have to want to look at demand generation in a lot more detail. You may not be able to win so many of the larger contracts because the larger deals are going to be heavily scrutinized if a procurement process is looking at budgets and costs very carefully. So it could be smaller deals, but more of them, that's going to help you manage, the recession. One can't afford to be complacent. It's attention to detail on every aspect of managing the different levers at the disposal of the sales leader to maximize performance. It's keeping the sales team motivated, when the opportunities aren't there. It's actually getting together, coming up with innovation campaigns that can actually sort of drive interest. So there are many things that a sales leader needs to do to stay ahead of the curve, but it's hard, because it's hard in a market that's shrinking to actually sort of maintain the velocity of pipeline and to maintain those sales revenues according to what you forecasted. So there's going to be a lot of sales leaders very worried, about how they're going to hit targets this year.
Well, good luck to them. And one of the ways they can perhaps increase their likelihood of hitting target is to follow the positive and outstanding mindsets.
Well, we do come back to the positive mindset so often. And, we always ask the question, what's more important? Is it mindset or skills? And when you have a situation when you're in a crisis, or, and you have these, what I call pivotal moments when you've really got to step up. It's at that point that the mindsets become most noticeable and most important. And so, yes, I've talked about being creative already, but it's also, being bolder. It's being client-centric. It's strategizing. It's working out which of your clients, where is the budget to be found within the client portfolio that you've actually got. So the mindsets are terribly important. It's choosing the moments of what to sell to whom. The risk is that the sales leader puts so much pressure on the sales organization to hit targets, is that it drives the negative mindset behavior, of being supplier centric, of being arrogant, of being manipulative to try and close deals when the deals simply aren't there to be had. So yeah, I think the positive mindsets are key, but I think there's another thing that's important, which is around resilience. There's some great podcasts that we've got that I would urge people to listen to, from ex-army generals and Royal Marine commanders, talking about mental strength at times of adversity. And I think that is resilience something you can train in people, or is it something that is part of one's personality? You're either resilient or you're not. I don't know if you've got a point of view on that, Luke. It would be interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, I've been looking at the mindsets as a source of reflection on my first 6 months at Consalia, and I've had a great time at Consalia in my first half year, but my sales performance was slightly below target. So when I conducted a review into my line of business, apprenticeships, you know, what can I do to improve the situation, turn it around by the end of the year? I used the mindset survey tool, and I tried to be really honest and answer it from, how do I think I have been selling to customers? Not what's the amazing ideal that I try to be good all the time. So I was very honest and answered it in quite a vulnerable way. And the negative mindset that came out for me was being too supplier centric, which you mentioned just then. I suppose what we mean by that, for someone who's not familiar with the mindsets, is it's quite simply making it all about me, or making it all about my product and what makes Consalia Business School brilliant. You know, going into sales conversations sort of expecting to get a deal, so sort of verging on that arrogance where you feel that you own the right to have the deal, or own the right to have the conversation. And where that was really useful is there's no point going through a time of adversity, so let's call it that, a time of adversity where I haven't hit my goals for the first half of the year. There's no point spending too much time looking at the positives, because usually your positive characteristics will be there all the time. But by looking at the mindsets, I was able to go, do you know what, Luke? Let's look back at your emails. Let's go look at the source of the way you're talking to people. Are you having enough conversations in person, or are you being lazy, just trying to get it all done over Teams? You know, have you been willing to visit the customer site? And by doing that, I came up with a rationale of new things I could do to not be as supplier centric in the second half of the year. So I think that period of adversity was very important for me to develop as a salesperson, but it was useful to see it in the form of the mindsets, because the mindsets are very broad to begin with. They're very, you know, just 4 very simple quadrants, if you will. But then it really gives you a clear rationale for what you can do to get those better outcomes in the future. And for me, it was there, it felt like it was there on a plate. By just answering 20 questions about my professional practice, it told me that, you know, what you're doing wrong is you're supplier centric.
But I think that what you've done that's very good is that you've clearly spent some time reflecting on the sort of so what and now what, you know, kind of questions. And I think that it's the call to action which has enabled you to actually come up with some, very simple but very important changes in the way that you approach customers, which is great to hear. So
I've kind of answered the question that I was about to ask you, because the question is, when is the best time to use this tool with my sales teams? And I suppose, you know, my answer there is firstly, it was mid-year, so it wasn't too late to rectify the problem, and I guess it was part of a mid-year review. So when do you think is the best time to use the sales tool, and would you agree that it could become part of PDRs and performance reviews within sales teams?
Well, it certainly can now. I mean, it's been a recent sort of innovation that the mindset tool that we have now on the website can be date stamped. You know, so we're able to see progression over time. But I've given it you know, sort of quite a lot of thought, in the sense that Um, uh, there could be, yeah, mid-year reviews is great at the beginning of the year. It's quite good to know where you are with your not just your own personal reflections, but actually to get input, which you can now do using the tool from your customers on your performance around the mindsets. And you can, you know, you could certainly use that to track into KPIs. And we've got clients now who are absolutely doing that. You know, they're beginning to embed this, you know, the sales mindset approach across not just salespeople. Actually, it's, you know, customer support and application engineers and so on. But I'm also I also think it's something that could be done on an opportunity, you know, which may happen during the year. That one could start to look at your opportunity plan and to run the analysis on how that particular customer might see you at that point in time. And what's become interesting is that with all the goodwill in the world, and if we had all the time in the world, we would want to be in what we call the winner's circle, you know, with the positive mindsets all the time. But it's pretty difficult to do that, because if you're servicing, you know, a lot of accounts, you know, it's impossible to get around all those accounts and live the positive mindsets, because you simply don't have the time to do it, unless you are a key account manager, perhaps looking after just one or two accounts where you can. So I think that in terms of the timing of the mindset survey, again, you know, what you've suggested is absolutely true. You can do the self-assessment at the beginning and mid-year reviews. You can definitely link it to a KPI setting. But I think it can go beyond that as well, to opportunities and the way in which key account plans are built, using the mindsets as well. It's got a lot of application, which is not just at the beginning or mid-year. It could be done almost at any time.
Mm. What's the difference between we're talking the difference between sales education and sales training? So if we look at sales education, perhaps one of the sort of height of our business school being the masters in sales transformation, and what makes that different to a 2-week training course? Let's say you went off 2 weeks residential, companies paid for it, probably quite a lot of money. What are the key differentiators between those two approaches to developing salespeople?
I remember when I first started in the sales training sort of industry, the typical, you know, duration of a sales training course was not 2 weeks, you know, unless it was a boot camp type environment, which might have been a month even of dedicated sales training, which used to be around mainly product training, to be honest, and how to sell the features, advantages, and benefits of product. But and they called it sales training. But the duration was typically 3 days, and you know, you would sheep dip everyone and put them through put everyone in the organization through a 3-day course, and there might be some sort of follow-up to that, but often there wasn't. You know, just everyone was told to go on a particular training course, and that was it. Sales education is very different. I mean, it's typically externally accredited, which means that the discipline required to provide evidence of having met standards, it is embedded into an undergraduate degree or an exec master's program. The biggest cost for a sales education program is not the delivery, it's the assessment. And that's a big difference between sales training, where the biggest investment tends to be in the delivery. And so, you know, you first of all have got the, you know, time. is a big difference. 2 weeks to 2 years is a huge difference. With sales education, with its intent to focus on outcomes and standards, you have a lot more investment in projects inside the, you need to provide evidence that you understood theory and that you've understood practice, and you need to show degrees of reflective thinking, which suggests that the impetus is very much based on the individual to respond. You're expecting them to absorb ideas and then in our case, sort of develop their own theories of practice through the type of degrees that we run. So the degree of learning is on a different plane. The approach to learning is very different, where it's much more focused on the individual rather than giving individuals information. You're asking individuals on the sales education program to actually come up with their personal reflections and then provide evidence that they've applied that learning in the workplace and critical reflection. But I think one of the other key sort of differences between sales training and sales education is currency, in that in sales training, you go on a course and you can say you've attended it, but you come out with it with no currency. On an undergraduate degree, you end up with a BSc, or you end up with a master's, or you end up with a PhD. And that is that's a statement of quality. That's a statement of the amount of knowledge and professionalism and ethical training that you've received as part of that particular journey. So there's just a massive difference between sales training and sales education. And most organizations probably are familiar with sales training, fewer with sales education, but that's obviously something we're trying to change.
If we're trying to change the status quo so that sales education is seen as the primary route to professionalizing the industry rather than sales training, then we'll need organizations to create a sales academy, in a sense, a dedicated infrastructure to developing their salespeople. And that indeed is one of the questions, is what steps can I take to developing a sales academy within my organization to help salespeople grow in their roles?
I remember one of the very first projects we ever had in the sales training organization that I started off with, was helping to design the sales academy for Apple, and it was essentially a place in which you could source training content on a huge number of different topics that related to both sales and service management. And I've seen many organizations since then adopt this sort of concept of building an academy. The word academy suggests it's academic, but in those days, the academy were typically sales training solutions that were put into a curriculum that people could attend. So there's a definition that's kind of required. If an organization want to set up a sales academy, one of the questions they need to ask themselves is, what are the outcomes that you're looking for from an academy? Is it just a nice way to brand the way in which you may offer training and development solutions to your team? or is it something where you want to offer individuals in the sales team a route to a academic qualification in addition to sales training that could be offered on a broader basis? So I think a lot of this is to do with ambition, and it sort of starts off with a kind of vision of what is it that you're trying to achieve by setting up so-called an academy. It's very easy to get quite excited by the notion of building a brand around the different training solutions that you have. But actually, when you start to peel away the layers, it's an incredible investment. You need to think through the different functions that you have within the sales force. You need to look at the knowledge, skills, and behaviors of those different functions. You need to then start to look at what kind of curriculum we need to put in place to take people through an introductory, intermediate, and advanced sort of levels of performance within the academy. You need to ask yourself questions about how we're going to assess whether people have reached certain standards. What are the gateways that you need to go through in order to progress in an academy to whatever level? So all of these kind of questions need to be kind of reviewed and reflected upon, and careful consideration made to, does the organization have the resources internally to be able to manage an infrastructure that can support sales development within the framework of an academy, in whichever way you want to define it? There are options, of course, that are available to customers. You can either decide to build an academy in-house with your existing sales enablement team, and some of the larger companies are able to do that, or you could potentially outsource it, to a sales training provider or a sales education provider, depending on, which route you want to go through. So there are different routes to go, but it's the danger is if you don't do it properly, the sales organization for whom it's destined will become skeptical if all of a sudden, this promise of this incredible development opportunity doesn't get realized. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's about vision, it's about intent, it's about getting stakeholder involvement at the highest level. It's about securing budget to set it up in the right way. It's about the vision you have about, the pathways you want to build into the academy to help people progress. But get it right. And it's a fantastic magnet for new talent, and it's a fantastic retention tool. So that there are major economic benefits for doing it, but don't underestimate how involved it is to set up an academy in the right way. And
there are many good case studies of great success with sales academies. So,
which ones were you thinking of, Luke?
Well, I think Royal Mail. I'm biased because I used to work there, but I think Royal Mail, what they did, and also what they're doing in the future. They're looking at ways to develop all areas of the sales force, from creating a funnel of apprentices coming in, but also looking at ways they can develop their senior leaders. And from my experience, they were quite open with their employees about giving them opportunity to develop. If they want, they also offered the level 4 while I was there. I did the level 6, and the employees doing the level 7. So what they've done is they've gone to various suppliers, not just Consalia, and created call it an ecosystem of qualifications that are available to students. And that worked because quite quickly, they were able to have an offering for everyone in the sales force. And I think, you know, if I say from personal experience, I know from being like one of the infantry, one of the troops in Royal Mail, should we say, that it's important that you are given that opportunity. So I think that's why they're a good, really good case study on that, and even more so that they were recognised in the Princess Royal Training Awards as well. So it's not just my measly opinion. Princess Anne thinks they did quite a good job as well.
That's great. No, you're quite right. I think that there are organisations who've actually had quite a long tradition of taking development very seriously, and you've been very fortunate to be part of one of those organisations with that sort of vision. And you know, they've always had a reputation for setting the sort of higher standards, you know, for sales development and training. So yeah, I completely buy into what you're saying there.
It's great in my role to, when I see, particularly with the level 7 postgraduate diploma, when I see students come onto that course, there's one of the first things they talk about is how valued they feel by their organisation, that their organisation has put them on this programme. So I think that's a really important thing for, you know, any of our HR, any of our L&D, any of our listeners, you know, in sales enablement, to know that that's the reality of some of the programs we offer, is the employee value. Let's go back to sort of a sales practice question.
Right.
A very nice, short, snappy one. So, what is the best way to sell with intent?
What do you mean by the word intent? Intent to close, intent to. So I'm really interested to know what that means. So what?
And it was one of the questions submitted. So I'm going to have to assume what they mean by selling with intent. I suppose maybe the person means outcome orientated by intent. What's the best way to sell with intent? Intent means there's a purpose. So how do you sell with a clear goal in mind?
Golly. Well, I think a lot of this has to do with kind of a personal vision of how you want to sell, and you talk about intent and purpose, and you know, purpose is quite an individual thing. You know, a deep exploration of how do you want to engage with your customers? What kind of values and belief systems do you want to have that's going to drive your sales approach? Is an essential kind of first step. And the sort of visualization of that in your mind, you know, we talk about sort of outcome based, we use this term before, but actually picturing in your own mind about how it is you want to be perceived as a salesperson, is a really important first step. And you know, without that vision, nothing else will happen. I think once you've then got to that outcome, it's then a question of considering, well, what are the steps that I need to sort of go about realizing that outcome and that purpose. And it could be some of the things we've talked about on this call. It could be, you know, sort of engaging with customers with questions about how they want to be sold to. It could be in the way that you follow a particular sales methodology or a sales approach. It could be around the basic disciplines of how you manage your time and how you manage the tools and processes that you have at your disposal. But your degree of application is going to be very much, you know, back to that sort of inner motivation that you've got about what is your intent. Now, I would suggest that, you know, intent is very much driven around some sort of notion of providing customers with, the best solutions possible. And that, towards that intent, your role as a salesperson is to understand that customer really well. It's to try and think for the customer, think ahead of what the customer might be thinking, to bring innovation and new ideas to them that perhaps they haven't thought of before. No customer's going to turn away from that notion. So yeah, I think it's, what's the best way to sell with intent? I think it's to be fully grounded in, knowing who you are as an individual, and that you're able to express that through every point of engagement with a customer. And but I suspect there may be other people who are perhaps listening into this call who have different ways of defining what what is meant by this word intent. If your intent is to close and that's it, then you're going to be adopting perhaps more manipulative sales techniques towards that goal, but that may be your intent. Is that you may be driven by very much how much money can I make from this sale, from this customer, and that drives your intent. But one thing's for sure is that customers themselves are going to be looking for what is the intent behind the salesperson that's selling to me, and can I trust this salesperson to sell to me in the way that I want to be sold to. So I suppose the caveat that I would, I would suggest is defining intent through the customer's perspective is perhaps a good way to go about defining, therefore, what is the best way to sell.
It has to be the customer's perspective.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, the first thing that comes to mind for me with selling with intent, it goes back to my intention, and it goes back to that issue of supplier centricity. Yeah. When I was looking at my practice for the first period of the year, and if the audio's gone bad, everyone, it's because it's raining quite heavily, but you should still be able to hear me. And when I think about intent, it takes me back to that selfish desire to what do I want. So I as a BDM, I sit there at the start of the day and think, yeah, I want this person to buy from me A, B, C, D, blah blah blah. And when I'm too driven by intent, I start caring less about what the customer wants and focus entirely on what I want. And when I was going back through, for example, looking at the language I was using in emails for that period of time, it was very much action orientated to favor myself. So it was, when can you come on a call to talk to me? When our cohort will be starting on this day, just to let you know, because of course you're going to want to give me a load of students. So I suppose it's a short question, and therefore almost the shorter the question, the broader it is. So we could talk about it all day. But yeah, that was just my thoughts on intent, is that it's very closely related to being too supplier centric. And I'm glad you made the point about customer perspective.
Right. Great, thank you.
Well, it brings
us. Do we
us
have time, or we're nearing the end? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it looks like we're nearing the end. And there's one question there which perhaps we could save for the next AMA because it's quite beefy, and I'm not sure if we'd have the time.
Okay, perhaps we'll save that one for next time then, Luke.
Yeah, it looks like a great question, but whether I could get it out of you in a couple of minutes, I don't know. And also, I think my audio has got very bad in the last couple of minutes.
Okay. Well, why don't you save it for next time then?
Let's save it for next time. So if you join next time, you'll have a question on transformation through coaching. And I'm sure
Okay, that's a great one. Yes.
And I'm sure many more from the people who leave comments and send their emails in with the questions for requests.
Okay,
So,
that's great. No, good set of questions. And thanks, Ian, again for you participating as well on the call. Not sure if Ian is still with us.
I think he might be coming back.
Yeah, I've been here throughout, Phil, and it's been a very enjoyable and entertaining experience. Thank you.
Okay. That's great. Now we're in a rainstorm here in London, so,
Yeah,
so you can probably hear. That's great. Well, nice to have you on the call again, Ian, as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Luke,
Right,
thank
in
you
which
very
case,
much.
we'll bring it to an end and bid everyone a farewell for the day.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
thanks for coming on, Phil.
Yeah, thank you. Cheerio. Bye-bye.